going to, it's going to be reflective. I'm going to get you thinking about the traditional grading system, learn about the grading practices that Lead STEM Academy has implemented, and provide resources to help you implement untraditional grading practices if you would like to do that yourself. And it has been a little while since I've been virtual, so bear with me on the tools. So is this for a grade? We're going to talk about 3 ways we are lessening the frequency of this question at Lead STEM Academy through proficiency-based grading, a growth model for grades, and non-traditional tracking of learning. So at our school, everybody implements proficiency-based rating, but how we are doing that is different in some different classrooms. And so I'm going to talk to you about those. So is this for a grade? We hear it all the time. Instead, we'd rather hear things like inquisitive questions. What would happen if? Can I try this? Or engaging comments like, look what I discovered, or I wonder, right? We want those things happening in our classroom. So we're frustrated that we're constantly getting is this for a grade? So why? Where is the disconnect between grades and learning? I don't have a magic answer to this, but I have some reflective questions to maybe guide us to some thoughts on this. So let's reflect. And you can put this in the chat, or if a couple people want to just unmute and talk about it. Does anybody have a positive experience you've had as a learner in the traditional grading system that they would like to share? And feel free to unmute if you'd like.
I won't leave you hanging. Grades, I think, differentiate between the winners and the losers. So a positive experience, if you get a good grade, you get to play ball. If you get good grades, you don't get in trouble at home. If you get good grades, you can do your homework faster and still get the benefit. You may not work as hard for those grades. You may be a good test taker for those grades. I think grades are very subjective.
Yes, Melanie, I think being able to test out of a class, it's a positive. Okay, earning a higher GPA, which probably came with some bonuses there, right? Like maybe scholarship opportunities or things like that. How about the flip side? Who has a negative experience you've had as a learner in the traditional grading system? It's okay if you can't recall a positive. Maybe you didn't have a positive, which is part of the point I'll eventually be getting to here. For some of us, a negative might be you worked really hard on something, and then you end up getting a low grade, and you're like, what? I thought I did so well, or things like that. Skipping readings and boring assignments might actually be a positive, depending on how you're looking at it. Yep, grades work against self-esteem. So what is the purpose of grades? Exactly, Joshua. I've had lots of experiences like that, working really hard and only getting a C. Okay, it should be to assess learning, to demonstrate learning. sometimes to track where people are being placed with opportunities and things like that. That goes to a good point, Carrie. That is what it used to be used for. That's why grades were started, to show mastery. I'd say they can be used for a communication tool, right? To let families know, let students know where they're at. Now, I'm not sure as we're answering this question if we're getting what is the purpose or what are they used for, which I think are two separate questions. So, what do you believe grades represent? So, there's where there's two separate questions. What should the purpose be? But what is it actually representing at this point? Okay, strict requirement. I'm going to push back with you on Joshua for a minute, but I think a growth model can show growth. Memorization more than mastery. The purpose should be to assess the level of understanding. Gotcha. Do you think it represents responsibility at this point? Who's turning in work? Who's not? Final reflective question here. Do grades motivate learning? Pay very close attention to that last word of my question, learning. Not do they motivate work getting turned in, but do they motivate actual learning? Mhm. They can make students give up. So is this for a grade? What other questions have you asked yourself about grades? As a learner, have you ever said, how many points is this worth? Can I have extra credit? What if I didn't do this assignment? How would it affect my grade? Why is this for a grade? How many of us, you don't have to admit it, have calculated whether or not we even had to take a final exam or that we could get a D on it and still keep the grade that we wanted? What's in it for me? Exactly. I'm looking at the chat at the same time. So as a learner, we have probably asked, is this for a grade ourselves? And also, how are these things going to affect my grade? We weren't always thinking, how or what are we going to learn out of doing this assignment or this task? Is this for a grade? Is being asked, I believe, because school has become a game and getting the grade is how you win. It's not about the learning. So is it possible that grades restrict learning because students are afraid to do something wrong, and so they don't try something that could expand their learning? So I too was very frustrated with this is it for a grade question. Teaching online in 2020, I taught computer science. They weren't turning on their cameras. I can't always see what they're doing. And I needed them to show me that they were able to, put the alligator clip on something, get the code to work, make something flash. So I needed them to be giving me some videos, things like that. I also had a lot of just basically 16 little things that I like overall wanted them to remember and be working towards as far as vocabulary and things like that. So I was going to give a little quiz, and it was for myself. It wasn't for them. I wanted to check for understanding. I needed some results of this. Like, how are we doing with these main objectives? And immediately, students, is this for a grade? And I was like, I just want to see where we're at so I can help, drive instruction type of thing. And one kid said to me, well, okay, I was just curious because I just got done being grounded from this class because I had a bad grade. And I didn't know you were going to give a quiz today. And my light bulb, like, mind exploded, right? These kids are not necessarily asking, is this for a grade, to be rude or to imply that they're not going to do it or that they don't want to do it. It's because they are constantly calculating that grade to make sure at home, am I going to be able to have the privileges I want? That kind of thing. If their home is giving that pressure, right? So there could be differences. There could be some kids who don't want to do it. There could be some kids who would rather have an F for not doing anything than to have the bad grade when they've really tried hard, as we have some people in the chat who remember that themselves, right? So some background at Lead STEM Academy. We started as a magnet school in 2018, and they were rolling out proficiency-based grading there before the district, Clark County School District, started that themselves. I was immediately gravitating towards that. I liked that idea of not having the traditional constant point values, right? When I say game, they can calculate, okay, how many points do I need to get a certain grade? I would also have some students, again, in 2020, those were my aha moments, who I was like, okay, get X, Y, and Z. I just need to see this and you won't be failing anymore. Or I can get you to a B. You need to show me this evidence. And they're like, I'm good with a C, or I'm good with. And so even that part, the grading piece, maybe we're good with a C and we're not striving to get better. But if we're in a more of a proficiency based and we're talking, I'm emerging at this level, or I'm developing, I'm proficient, or I'm extending, we're never quite getting to a spot where we want to end if we are using that vocabulary differently. So I became very passionate about proficiency-based grading when a lot of teachers were still sticking their feet in the mud and saying, no, this isn't working, whatever. And in the summer of 2021, I think, my principal at the time sent me an article about an ungraded classroom and things that were happening and things that they had found from working in ungraded classrooms. So I jokingly said, can I pilot this next year? And he said, yeah. And I forgot about it. Then when we did come back from the COVID year, I remembered a couple weeks into class, I was like, oh yeah, I was thinking about piloting this. So I went back to him and I said, can I do this? And he said, yes. So I rolled it out to my students, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go. But I did an ungraded classroom, no grades, except one, because I had to comply with a report card and things like that, right? So I opened it up to them and I said, we're trying something new. This is what we're going to do. We are still doing work. We are still doing tasks. We are still doing everything that we would have done in this classroom regardless, but there was not a constant grade being put in the grade book. And I learned a lot about my students, and I'm going to share that in a little while. And that's why I continue to talk now about these experiences, because I think it changed some students' mindsets. So a couple of books here, Ungrading and Hacking Assessment. I've hosted some book studies on there. And this little image here, I know it's controversial, especially in the Clark County School District, about the minimum F versus a 0, but I think this picture really shows the equity in a proficiency-based grading system and not the traditional system. And I'm just going to kind of leave it at that for now. So I told you that we've done some different things at LEAD. So I started with a ungraded classroom. Everybody was doing proficiency-based. And now we have some people who are dabbling in a growth model. So at our school, we are 0% formative and 100% summative, which as a learner, if I would have had that, I would have high anxiety. I was a horrible test taker. I relied on participation points and homework points and things that I could do in my own time, because when something wasn't timed, I performed better. And so some teachers are taking on, especially like math teachers. So maybe we have like a 4-week unit, and that'd be a long time to not tell a parent or students where they're at in their learning. So they'll start the unit, and midpoint, they'll give an assessment. Let's say the student scores a 2, and in our school that's developing. Okay, that's where they are right now. And it goes in the grade book as a summative assessment, as a snapshot right now. Then at the end of the unit, a student scores a 4. That replaces the previous 2. That 2 in the grade book, you just need to change to formative. Now it's 0%, and they get their 4. An old system, we may have said a 2, now a 4, they're going to earn a 3. In this system, it's growth. I think like Joshua said, the grades can show growth. In this model, they can. In some other models, it just averages, doesn't necessarily show a start to a finish. And so this is one way that teachers are able to put in the grade book where you're at and communicate knowledge or mastery at that level, at that point in time, and then later changes. Are there any questions on this? Nope, we are not weighting either. So everything in our school is 4 points. So a 1 emergent, 2 developing, 3 proficient, 4 exemplary, and it's a 1 through 4. And then we have marks. So a 4 is 95%, a 3 is 85%, a 2 is 75%, and a 1 is 65%. Any other questions on the growth model? And feel free to say them verbally.
Would the new score replace the old test even if they did worse on the new test?
So I know, I don't think so. And you have to wonder, and I haven't actually done this model. I'm just reporting on what some teachers have done. At that point, you've got to ask yourself what happened from a 2 to now a 1, right? If we're looking at the same unit and halfway through they had a developing understanding of something and then they suddenly drop, what happened, right? And so I would say retesting or having conversations. Maybe that was just a super bad day and finding out what happened with that student. So no, I wouldn't say it would change in the opposite direction. Any other questions? Okay, so, oh, yep. So we still have to go into a grade. So when I say that a 4 is 95%, that still goes into infinite campus, is what we used at Clark County. And it's still mathematically putting in, everything is still in the grade book, calculating a GPA, all those things. So my ungraded classroom, when I let my students know about it, I introduced it. I said, we are trying something new. We're the only people in the school trying this. I made sure that they understood that we're going to work through this. We're going to talk it through like all steps of the way. And I made a promise that they would never know never be surprised at what their quarter grade was going to be. They would know along the way where they were at in the proficiency level. I also let them know that I'm not the only one in the world who is trying this. There's a whole ungraded hashtag community on Twitter. So I gained their trust. I made sure, like I said, I promised them they would not be shocked with their quarter grades. And we had to do a change in language. I was still saying, so what we did is they reflected on their grade. They said where they felt where they were at. And my only flaw putting this together that very first time or first progress grade is I forgot about progress grades. So progress reports, right? So that very first time I had to quickly put a grade in for them. Every other time they reflected. And so they would tell me where they thought they still were. And very quickly I explained to them the proficiency level using a metaphor or analogy of a swimming pool. And so a 1 is just dipping your toe in the water. You're in the shallow end, just on the stairs, maybe afraid, maybe needing some assistance getting into the water. That's emerging into the content. Developing is practicing all your skills in the shallow end, everything you need to know to be able to swim. You're comfortable practicing that in the shallow end, but you're not ready to go into the deep end yet. Proficient is I can swim back and forth, no problem, through that swimming pool. And a 4 is I can do everything. I can jump off the diving board. I can go in for the rings. I can help somebody else who is still in the shallow end to develop their skills. And so I had 2 rubrics for their reflection, that one, and then more educational terms for them. And so they would reflect before the end of each quarter or each progress reporting time. And I had some kids who would say, I'm still in the shallow end. I'm just developing my skills. This is where I'm at. I would have some who would say they were a 3 because they understand. I was a computer science teacher, so I was coding. They understood the content. They could get their code to work, but they were not yet comfortable being able to explain to somebody else how they were able to do that or to help somebody else solve their problem. Yes, I would have some kids who were more of a 1 telling me they were a 3, and then we'd have a conversation. But we did not do this the day grades were due. We did it in a week in advance. And I would look at their reflection, I'd give them feedback, and I'd put it in the grade book, and I would tell them, at first I would tell them, if you want a higher grade, I need X, Y, and Z. And I needed to change my language there. And I started to say, if you want to show a higher level of proficiency, or you believe you're a higher level of proficiency, I need to see the following evidence. And then they would go back, maybe get some more work done, things like that, and then show me that proof of that understanding, and then reflect with me. Throughout that year, I would ask them questions about how it's going. I did have a handful of kids who were like, just give me the grade. I don't like this. But for the most part, it was very positive. I sent a letter home to parents about this. And I did not have not one parent who questioned it. I promised that they would know every week. They'd get a weekly email of what I did that week, and a file, like what they can expect the next week. And it was just a very quick email. And in that email, I would put a little nugget of, hey, kids, tell your parents about, or parents ask your kid about. And so then if a parent asks, hey, tell me about this interactive turtle. And if the kid's like, huh, what are you talking about? Then the parent can be like, ooh, maybe you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing in class. If they can rattle it off and explain, even if the parent isn't quite understanding, then the parent should know, okay, seems like they know what they're doing in that class, right? I also promised the parents that if their kid was still in looking like they were going to be emergent at the end of the quarter, they would get a personal communication from me. And so that very first quarter, I did spend some time on a Saturday making some phone calls, and I never had to do it again. Kids weren't emergent after that. They picked it up. They did what they needed to be doing. So what my students reported through this process. I have learned that having an ungraded classroom teaches me that I need to be more responsible and keep things in order. And if you see typos or whatever, that's because I took them straight from their Google form. I learned that I am a lot more free with how I work in the class. I don't have the pressure on my shoulders of having to worry about my grade dropping as much as I worry about it in my other classes. So there was proof to my original hypothesis that kids are asking, is this for a grade? Because it's the pressure they have on them to score well and not because they don't want to do it. Knowing that I won't see the grade throughout the course until the end relieves the anxiety and stress of potentially failing. Sometimes overthinking stuff can mess with one's performance. When I am allowed to move at my own pace, I do much better. I realized that I was trying harder to get the work done. I take that as not to learn the content, but to just get the work done. What I have learned about the ungraded classroom is not to worry about everything being summative or formative. And that argument then goes with well, they won't do my formative work. They know it's only worth 10%. They weren't even stressed. There was no summative and formative. I noticed that I learned more because I tried different things. I distinctly still remember who this student was, and it was 2 years ago. And this was a student who always had his work done, always had just get through it, done, knew what he needed to do, then would play games. And now instead, he was exploring and doing some more different creativity things. He was pushing himself and not just meeting the expectation and then stopping and playing a game. So I'm not going to say that your district requires that. Your principal might be saying it's a requirement. I learned that one assignment doesn't sum up who I am as a student because I can work hard and do better the next time. That should be the ultimate goal, right? Students motivated to try harder the next time. Does our traditional grading system encourage or discourage that type of thinking? You know, in education, we talk a lot about growth mindset. We push these things on students, and then we put a grade in the grade book and we say, sorry, no retakes, or sorry, the deadline's over, or right, we're preaching growth mindset. We're preaching we can start somewhere and we'll work towards something in the end, but these grades and certain stopping points don't always communicate that same message. And lastly, I learned that an ungraded classroom causes me to put a lot of effort in because it's based off of if I try and how much I accomplish rather than getting the average grade I learned in every assignment. In my other classes, I can, not saying that I do, miss other assignments, but the other assignments are good enough for an A. In here, I have to do all of the work in order to get the A since it's based on something else. And the something else was simply evidence of learning. So after I implemented that in one computer science class, our CTE department decided to try it out too. And so as soon as you take it from one person to a department, there's more brains and more ideas, right? And so they renamed it to a non-traditional tracking of learning because ungraded still had that grade in it, right? They're continuing to do the one summative assessment that is more reflective. Some are doing more of a like portfolio based, so showing that evidence. It's more student-centered. There's a discussion on evidence of learning. So our 6th grade CT department One particular thing that they do is isometric sketching. And so one of those teachers, to be able to show that you are a level 4 when you reflect, has them collect evidence. If you helped somebody else, show a picture of their original sketch and then how you've helped them and then what their end result is. So now you've shown your coaching abilities. So there's a discussion on the evidence of learning before the end of the quarter, as well as a reflection. So now I'm going to mention a few resources that I have been using and reading up on. Somebody mentioned earlier that grades were a way of tracking students and maybe what jobs they were going to, etc. And this book, Grading for Equity by Joe Feldman, actually does go through the history of grades, which I was very interested in. And it was during the Industrial Revolution when grades came out, and they were tracking who was going to go manage the factories, who was going to be on the assembly line, those type of jobs. And we wanted kids who could follow directions, who could just do the task. We didn't want somebody who was thinking outside the box. We didn't want somebody who was going to be creative, that kind of thing. And so we're in a different world. So that was an interesting explanation in this book. This book also lays out our grading software. And so it uses 2 examples of 2 separate students and 2 separate teachers' classrooms. If they were graded in teacher A versus teacher B, what their grades would be based on how we're putting in these percentages. If you're grading on participation, if you're grading on homework, if you have other forms of grading besides just like a summative, and those percentages. So they had student A, who was not a great test taker, who relied on, which would have been me as a student, who relied on homework or participation points and was getting a B in the class. And then we had another person who was a very good test taker and very knowledgeable of what was happening in class, but didn't do the homework and didn't do, didn't participate in class, and they were getting a D. But they knew the content, they could take the class, or they could, pass the content and then test in the class. So understanding that person who couldn't pass the content was earning a B, and the person who did know the content but wasn't doing the homework and the other things was actually earning a D. And so we have to pay attention to what's happening in our grading software and not just relying on the math that comes out at the end. And so just being mindful of how we are calculating grades. This book is 10 chapters of 10 different ways that you could implement an ungraded classroom. So when I say I don't have a magic answer to some of these things or to these processes, I don't, because it depends on your classroom. It depends on the level of comfort. It depends on those things. But 3 particular ones, keeping a checklist. I kept a checklist of here are the tasks that I needed them to be getting done in a period of time, reflecting on their understanding of that. And then the CTE department is doing like digital portfolios. And so those are all talked about in this book. This book, Hacking Assessment, just read a quote from the book. Not only do students sometimes see themselves as C students because they earned a C, has anyone met a student who was okay with just a C, who did the work just to earn the C? How can we help these students to be a growth mindset and not settle for a letter grade? We need to shift the mindset, shift the language. And so that's just one of the kind of aha things that came out of this book. And this again gave a lot of like things you can use now. And it was a quick and easy read. So how can we restructure our classrooms so students aren't just calculating how that assignment or task will affect their grade, but rather flip the focus back on learning and promote this 4 C's? That's because that was another conference I was at, but the creativity, the collaboration, those things, getting those things back into our classrooms. Something else to ponder before I start answering questions. The last two quotes I have from the students is, I have learned that it is easy to get a good grade. All you have to do is have good evidence on why you deserve that grade and make sure all your work is completed. I feel like that's what we all want as educators. That is our frustration with the, is this for a grade? Just do it, right? Don't worry about it. And that's what they're doing. That's what they did in my ungraded classroom. I learned to not worry about my grade, to just worry about getting the work done and learning. And I will say, some of those students who in the past had their hood on and their heads down weren't doing that in my classroom after I took grades away. So action steps, if you do want to get started, I'd say recalibrate our grade books and remember the purpose of our grades. So even if we're not changing, like in Clark County, you already have your 10 and 90 or 20 and 80%, that's mandated to you. So you don't need to recalibrate, but maybe what are we putting in as assessments? What are the point values? If you look at things and you do it as points, some assignments then are worth a lot more. If we just put it out of a percentage, same amount of points, like 100, everything's worth 100. Okay. Now I'm putting in just the percentage. So even that 5 question or 5-point assignment is worth the same as the 10-point assignment, because I'm putting it in as 100. Things like that, just thinking about how that grade is being calculated. Be confident in your practices. Be clear about how learning will be reported. Anytime someone is scared about change, it's because they don't know what to expect. So be clear the whole way around. How am I going to communicate with you? What are the expectations of my classroom? Know your content. What does it mean to be an A student in 7th grade science? You have an image of that, so you can help explain that. Don't let the numbers just talk for themselves. Keep open communication with all stakeholders. And remember that just because it has always been done that way doesn't mean that is the way it needs to be done. So what steps might you take to shifting grading practices in your classroom? And I'll leave this up for just some resources. And I think I can probably give this out so that because there's some links on here. But those are the books I referenced, the hashtag Ungraded on Twitter. There's a Growth Over Grades podcast that's awesome. And then I have my letter to parents in there, and just an article that I co-wrote with my principal last year. I know that was a lot of talking. I did see so posting grades weekly could be where you're maybe reflecting with students and still having that one grade where are we at, without having to be a constant averaging. So it could be a point in time. Now, I was fortunate. I wasn't a math class. I wasn't looking at different standards. You could say, this set of standards, I'm just going to use like number sense. Maybe in number sense, I have a grade. And I also have a grade in geometry, and I also have a grade in fractions, right? Because that's with that. So it doesn't have to just be one grade, but be cognizant of, am I putting 6 grades for one standard that are all averaging out, when really, if I look at everything together and they've redone things or they've reflected and they've shown other evidence, are they not just that average score, or are they a 4.32 or what? Does that make sense? I don't think it was hard to set up. I had an idea, I wrote the letter and to my kids. So when the CT department started, one teacher, she's like, Claire, I'm just so tired. At the end of the day, I go home so tired because I'm up and I'm having conversations and I'm writing stuff down, and doing all this stuff while kids are at school. I said, but what are you doing at home then? And she goes, nothing. So she was tired at work, which is fine because we're at work. And then she was free. She didn't have papers going home like we did before because we were assessing in moments. Are there any other questions I might have missed in the chat? And feel free to unmute to ask a question. You can. Let me. Here's the letter. And with the letter, here was my rubric. And then the numbers did change. That was the percentages that my principal had before. So we haven't had a perfect system, right? We have to think about how things were averaging out when we were putting in certain grades. So the 100% is maybe inflates a little bit. So we moved it to a 95%. And so when I say you need to know your content too, so in mine, I had like a digital kind of workbook that students were in. So something would turn green even when they like just turned the page. I knew they read it, turn green. And then there'd be little assignments, coding assignments. And so some of those they had to submit to me. So when it got submitted on my end, it was yellow. If I graded it and something was wrong with it, I'd leave a comment and it flags it red for them. And then if not, if it's good, I'd turn it green. So where it says if you've worked through things on independently, but you didn't go back to revise, they were still in that developing. So thinking about how you run your classroom, how they can show you the evidence of learning is how you'd want to make your 1 through 4. So again, with like administration and things that we have to do, I feel like even they're a stakeholder too. So when I say open communication with all stakeholders, let them know what you're doing. Let them ask permission. See, sometimes we have to have those blanketed statements, but if you can say, here's what I'd like to try, here's what I think is going to happen, here's how I'm going to make sure you admin aren't getting a phone call from angry parents, because that's also what they want to avoid, right? And showing that well thought out piece of it, I feel like gives you a leg to stand on. I have presented this at a couple of conferences now, and I do have some people who are emailing me, okay, how do I set up my grade book? I've got this, or I'm ready to go to my principal. I have this, this, and this. Do you suggest anything else? So if you ever want to bounce ideas off of me, doesn't mean that they're going to say yes, but we can't change anything if we don't suggest changes either. I will share one other little, so on the progress grades, very first, I gave a 1 through 4 on progress. So some of them, yeah, you're making progress, you're at 100%. And I felt like that gave them a false sense of security for the class. So the next progress grade, which would have been midway through a quarter, I said they could only earn an 85%. So they got a 1, 2, or 3. Because we weren't done with the quarter, you can't have exemplary status yet. And the only pushback there, I overheard a student one day who was like, I don't think that's fair. What do you mean I can't have 100 yet? And a very good kid who's always got that A, right? Just looked at me. She's like, just keep doing your work. You'll get it at the end of the quarter. You'll have the A, it's fine. Um, so they do start to understand and tell others as well. Any other questions, comments, or concerns? Well, I certainly don't need to hold anybody if you want to take a little extra break before your 3 o'clock, but if you want to stay on too and unmute. This might be the first time I haven't had pushback questions or comments. And I can share, oops. I can share my presentation and the slides as well. There's a copy of the slides if you so desire. Oops. I am reading a new book too. I don't know what I just did with it. It's shifting the mindset for grades, and let me see if I can find it. Actually, there's 2 more that are on my list to be reading. Grading from the inside out, bringing accuracy to student assessments through a standards-based mindset. So hopefully that'll be on my next list of resources. And then off the mark, how grades, ratings, and rankings undermine learning, but don't have to. So I'm looking forward to reading this one as well. I will note too, as people are saying, what about like GPAs and college applications? I'm reading a lot of articles about how even colleges are changing some things. I think some aren't even requiring like the ACT scores and things like that. Also, you have to understand that, you know, colleges do take in people from out of the country, and not everybody is grading the same or having the same type of transcripts, and they still work it out. Also, in some of my research, we don't have a standard way of grading all the way across the United States. And so you have to wonder too, yes, there's a grade point average, but does an A in one school equal to an A in another school? Like how we're finding those grades. So there's a lot of things to think about. I will say as you're saying the parents, the educator parents are usually the ones who are, no, you can't do this, and my kid won't do the work if they don't have this. So my husband's one of the CTE teachers, and he presented this at open house last year, and one of the teachers or one of the parents said, my kid won't do anything if it's not for a grade. And so when it came to the first reflection, he called me in to read this kid's reflection that had a full page of things he learned in that class, things he accomplished, what his evidence was. And so it completely proved her wrong. Well, again, thank you for coming, but you want to head to your next place, that's fine. Yes, Carrie. Grading for equity, everything that we had on our first Canvas rollout for CCSD proficiency based, I was like, I think that they've read this book. But it's somehow not trickling down to what's happening in schools. All right, well, I'll stop sharing, Mike. I think new people are coming in. You can probably stop recording too.